am also super thrilled, Warren, to have you here today. You know, this is the policy committee. And as you know, when you sort of look at Japan, one of the great things we all agree on, wow, Japan is cool. Yes, fashion, design, music, Japan is very, very cool. And then sort of the debate ends and nothing really happens. And, you know, actually it was Bill Emmett, my friend, who sent me your paper. And I read your paper on the impact of Japanese cool on grime music. I have no idea what grime music is, but I read the paper, and I must say, Funabashi-sensei, I'm sorry, this was the best paper on Japan I have read in over a decade. So, you know, Warren, very, very good to have you here.
Thank you.
And to learn a little bit about, you know, how you interpret, how you follow, you know, Japan, cool Japan, actually influencing what goes on in the rest of the world. So very much looking forward to your talk. You have the floor.
Thank you so much for that really flattering introduction. I think I should just stop there. I don't know if we can get better than that. But yeah, I just want to say what an absolute honor it is to be invited to speak here at the Asia Society Japan. I'm really grateful to Jesper, Hidaka-san, all of the organizers, the International House for hosting us in this wonderful space. Thank you for really making me feel welcome and at home, and you've prepared some British weather for us today as well, so I feel at home because of that as well. I want to acknowledge everyone attending in person bright and early and also online. I have several guests here today, so thank you for coming out, including my old boss and mentor, Dr. Yoichi Funabashi, so thank you very much for coming here today as well. So for my talk today, I will introduce the cultural phenomenon of grime music. And in doing so, I would like to suggest that for some, Japan isn't just cool, it's cold. But first, we need to remind ourselves of what we already know about cool Japan. So there's been a wealth of books on that have looked at the worldwide spread and popularity of Japanese goods and cultural content. The story goes that, especially from the 1990s, Japan emerged as a global cultural superpower. Office workers in New York began eating sushi for lunch and ramen for dinner. Kids in LA were ferociously reading manga and then going to comic conventions dressed in cosplay. Paris saw a new Japonism of rakugo performances and arts and crafts, or a rising middle class across East Asian and Southeast Asian cities were singing J-pop songs at karaoke parties, or dreaming of ski trips and urban love stories that they'd seen in Japanese TV dramas. The world seemed to be turning Japanese. And more recently, we might talk about Marie Kondo kind of helping us to declutter our hectic lives so that we can tap into our ikigai, or the healing Animal Crossing game, soothing our strained souls during the pandemic. And yes, explanations of cool Japan have almost always been associated with warm tones and kind of the fluffy, kawaii, cute goods, right, like we see on the screen. What the academic Christine Yano has called pink globalization. And we also know a lot about the ups and downs of the Japanese government's official Cool Japan campaigns. So they're intended to leverage this popularity for soft power gains or to boost the economy. But as Jesper pointed out in the introduction, we know a lot less about the intricacies of how the spread of Japanese pop cultural goods has impacted and even transformed other cultures, or how people consume it and what exactly they're doing with it. But before we look at kind of cold Japan in more detail, let me first set the scene with an introduction to grime music, because I'm sure for many of you it will be the first hearing of it. So grime is often described in shorthand as Britain's take on rap music with a rapid electronic sound. It emerged in the early 2000s as an underground music that traces its roots to kind of an eclectic mix of genres, jungle, reggae, dancehall, American hip-hop, garage. And today grime has entered the mainstream. It's celebrated as one of the most popular and innovative music genres in the UK. For example, a BBC article talked about it as the punk music for the 21st century. So it's within that working class tradition within the UK. I guess you could even say stretching back to people like Charles Dickens in the Victoria era, talking about kind of the working class life, and then punk music in the mid-20th century. And now its latest iteration is in the form of grime music. This is a photo of Stormzy. He's currently one of the UK's biggest selling artists, and he's wearing a Banksy-designed vest, performing or headlining at the Glastonbury Festival. So grime is massive. But let's begin our journey by going back to grime's beginnings, underground. And so I'd like to follow the story of grime and cold Japan in the form of a game, if you allow me to. You don't have to do anything, so he's here in the audience, so don't worry. So let's start our game. Like any good game, we need to select a player. So let's call our protagonist Grime Boy. Our Grime Boy was born in the 80s or early 90s. And the time period is now the early 2000s. And our Grime Boy was most likely a young black working class male who grew up in the inner cities of Britain. As this famous album cover really powerfully demonstrates, our Grime Boy was literally pushed to the margins and edges of society with little by way of opportunities, or was often demonized as the devilish, dark-hooded gangster roaming the streets. Yet, we can also see that the Grime Boy is staring back at the viewer with these bright yellow panels behind him. He wants to speak about his corner of the world. He wants people to hear his voice. But the problem is, he's the boy in the corner, right, as this album is called, the boy in the corner. He doesn't have a voice yet. And so he's still searching for this voice. I think this quote really puts it best by one of the grime pioneers, JME. Before grime, never had a voice. Grew up in Tottenham, I never had a choice. Now, I want you all to remember this key word, the ends. It's a slang word that means one's local area or the streets or the hood. And our Grime Boy wants to express and give voice to his life and his world in the ends. And these alternate realities of being poor, black and marginalized in the ends, they exist out of those state-centered narratives of cool Britannia or Britain is great, kind of nation branding. Outside of narratives of urban revitalization benefiting the working classes, outside of narratives of a post-racial, multicultural society. Another grime artist, Dizzy Rascal, he puts it like this: I swear to you, it ain't all teacups, red telephone boxes and that. Nah, man, I'm going to show you it's gritty out here. And that's where grime gets its name from. It's literally means filth, dirt, grubby, gritty, grotty. It's all of those words encapsulated into this grime. And our Grime Boy especially wanted to make a sound that was cold. The coldness was first expressed by Wiley He's the self-proclaimed godfather of grime. And he made this kind of collection of songs in the early 2000s. And a lot of the song names were full of these cold themes. So he called them Igloo, Eskimo, Ice Pole, Ice Cream Man, and many others. This idea and feeling of coldness, it reflects those grimy realities of life in the ends in Britain. The weather is cold and dreary, and so was life. And so Wiley writes this in his book. He says, "It's a cold, dark sound because we come from a cold, dark place. These are inner city London streets. It's gritty." And so our grime boy was searching for a language to express and articulate these feelings of coldness. And the grime pioneers, they didn't have access to music studios or formal sound engineering education. This was an underground DIY job. They had to use what was ever around them, whatever they could get their hands on. Bedrooms and basements became their music studios, their pirate radio stations. Enter Japan. As children of the 80s and 90s, our grime boys grew up on a diet of Japanese pop culture. It was all around them in the form of games consoles, anime TV series on television, Street Fighter arcade machines in the local Afro barbers, gambling with Pokemon cards in chicken and chip shops or fish and chip shops, getting pirated copies of Dragon Ball Z out of the back of a dusty old van down the road or something like that. And this transnational flow of pop cultural content and affordable technologies from Japan became part of the fabric of our grime boy's life. And our grime boy wouldn't just play with these games in the traditional sense of playing. He would repurpose and play with these machines in totally new, unimaginable ways. And these cool Japan items became part of a suite of music-making equipment. But they weren't just refashioned into music-making equipment, as I said, or sound engineering tools. They also became the very language through which our grime boy came to interpret and understand their life in the ends, those feelings of coldness. So in other words, our grime boy's feelings of coldness of Black British life finally found its expression in the world's sounds and stories of Japanese pop cultural spaces. Our grime boy has finally found his voice. So the physical wires and fantasy worlds from Japanese pop culture entangled and fused with British life and African diaspora music cultures. And as a result, it created something completely new, this hybrid grime culture. But it's important to remember that it wasn't just everything that they were kind of taking from Japanese pop culture. It was very subjective and selective. It was the shadowy parts, in Praise of Shadows, or Ine Rai-san, as probably Tanazaki Junichiro would have said. It was specifically those themes and spaces that reflected those feelings of coldness that they were extracting, remixing, and refashioning, repurposing to make their music. So I'd like to suggest that these are cold parts or components or pieces. So for our grime boy, Japan isn't just cool, it's cold. So I want to share a few examples to illustrate this. First released in the 1990s, the Streets of Rage game. It's by Sega, a 2D scrolling beat-em-up. This is often cited as a way of expressing life in the ends of Black Britain. So the Streets of Rage game is set in a cyberpunk, futuristic city that has been taken over by a crime syndicate. They rule from towering skyscrapers above, and the streets below are full of have-nots. It's a lawless battleground with gangs and corrupt police. and the player has to fight their way through these streets. And the dystopian futures depicted in spaces like the Streets of Rage game activates those feelings of coldness, of life in the ends of Britain. This is their world. It's dark, there's gang crime, extreme wealth next to dilapidated urban spaces, unjust officials and unjust policing. Skepta puts it best in one of his songs. It's real life, no computer game. We're living in the streets of rage. And so grime artists constantly draw from these surreal spaces within Japanese pop culture that show cold, alienated futures. Because for grime artists, it's their lived reality in the present. This is an example of a music video where the artists have been transformed into game characters and spirited away into London's streets of rage. And it's not just kind of imagery in music videos. The songs and the sound effects from games like the Streets of Rage, those are the ones that are perceived to reflect and capture those feelings of coldness. And so it's exactly those sounds that they're mining, extracting, sampling, remixing, and alchemizing into grime music. And grime music is full of these cold sound effects from Japanese video games and anime worlds like beeps, suctions, swipes, chimes, coin-grabbing jingles, warrior charges, koto and shamisen sound effects, power-ups and dissonant chromatic runs. And so Wiley said that, again, the grime artist Wiley said that you hear people talking about grime, the sound coming from another planet. Well, that's because it does. Or other music scholars have said that grime seems to have come from underground caves or it was recorded underwater. And I would suggest that's exactly where it's come from in a way, in the sense that the soundscapes and sonic elements that they were using were drawn from those menacing underworld spaces from Japanese pop cultural content. The underground caves, the haunted temples, the dungeons and final boss battles in space. For example, a boss battle in space is how the artist, JME, merges life in the ends with Sonic the Hedgehog, the final boss battle in Sonic the Hedgehog. The boss battle is called the Doomsday Zone, and in JME's song, which appropriately is called Final Boss, he raps about the dangers of life in the ends of London. And to do so, he remixes the cold sounds from Sonic the Hedgehog and fuses his own voice to become robotic with the game. He matches the speed of life of the game, you could say. This is some lyrics from that song, and he says, "Blood, open your ears up. It's like no one hears us. No one cares, plus it's dangerous out here, cuz." And so in the song, he's lamenting that society doesn't care about the dangers of life in the ends. Our grime boy's voice is being ignored, but it's only through hybridizing with these cold Japan components that our grime boy can now articulate his world and those feelings of coldness of life in the ends and express it and get people to hear his voice. And so as a listener of these grime songs, we're constantly made to question, is this the real life or is this just fantasy, like Queen famously sung? And the answer, it's both. It's in between. And cold Japan gives us a way of understanding this space of cultural hybridity situated in between Japanese pop culture and urban black British life. And so another artist, AJ Tracey, this is one of his album covers, and it shows him transformed into an anime character running from a metropolis up in flames, which is clearly an allusion to the manga and anime film Akira. And so perhaps we can say that the ends of Britain is literally at the ends of the world. it's existing on the very edges, on the peripheries of British society. And so, in fact, our Grime Boy's world is much closer to the post-apocalyptic time spaces and science fictions that he found within Japanese pop culture spaces. So the cold ends of Black Britain melt together to become one with the cold ends of Japanese pop culture. As our journey through this story and game continues and slowly comes to a close, a new character has entered the scene. Our Grime Boy has powered up, like a Saiyajin, you could say, has evolved into the Grime cyborg. And we've already seen how these components, these cold components from Japanese pop culture, have been extracted and repurposed as electronic conductors to channel their voice. We can also say these cold components are like prosthetic enhancements that they can attach to themselves, their bodies, their personalities, their identities, to remake themselves. And it's the Grime cyborg speaks and expresses and performs through these cold attachments. So they're not just remixing sounds and elements, they're literally remixing themselves, their own identities. For example, in this hybrid space of cold Japan, they can play with their own identities. They can virtually reimagine themselves and perform as game or anime characters like Ash Ketchum Satoshi from Pokemon or Uzumaki Naruto from the Naruto series. And the logic of these fantasy worlds is that although you may be thrust into the wild with nothing, start life with disadvantages as an outsider, you can overcome these challenges to master the world that you live in. And so by becoming made in cold Japan, or remade in cold Japan, our Grime cyborgs can hack into and recode their identities through sonic and narrative glitches that disrupt society's original programming of them as Black British youth or black male bodies that would otherwise have them imprisoned in jail or trapped in the ghetto or limited to negative stereotypes. And so Grime's hybrid cultural space of Japan is also about inserting themselves into, as marginalized urban black youth, within an alternative vision of the future. And so Jeremy wraps here, because I know I need the future, but I need the future to need me. As children of the 80s and early 90s, they were regularly exposed to those images of Japan and Japanese technologies as what William Gibson once called the global imagination's default setting for the future. And so grime artists aren't only drawn to the familiar spaces or the familiar cold spaces within Japanese pop cultural content and artifacts. I would suggest that they also embrace the distant, alternative, or transgressive possibilities of alternate Japanese futures and postmodern time spaces. In this way, Japan, or cold Japan, possesses a sonic palette that displaces the sound waves of Western modernity. A Western modernity where science and technology has historically been used to thrust black bodies and blackness into the primitive past. This is an image of the phrenologist Samuel George Morton's infamous 19th century study on human skulls, which claimed to have discovered the closeness between African skulls and primates as proof of black racial inferiority. The grime cyborg, however, subverts this history of black backwardness by generating the sound of an alternative future. They have slipped out of history and landed in other futures, other Japanese futures, a new ice age, if you will, where they are the adapted, cold, post-human natives. And fortunately for us and for my research, grime artists have left traces and sonic fragments behind to us from somewhere out there in the distant future that we can excavate and dissect. I'll conclude here by saying that Cold Japan tells us a new story. A story not simply of Japan's popularity or its potential soft power influence. No, Cold Japan is a new story that reveals Japan's critical and enduring role in providing the tools and cultural space for soft empowerment in the 21st century. So that concludes our game, our opening remarks. If you would like to listen to some grime music, you can do so through a Cold Japan playlist that I prepared. And yeah, I look forward to sitting down with Jesper now and having a conversation.
Great, Warren. Thank you very, very much. But I was waiting for you to give us some hard beats or soft beats or some icy this, that, or the other. But I guess you know the Asia Society has to be very careful about intellectual property rights and all these sort of things. So please do listen to the music here. You know, fantastic. You know, let me sort of ask at the start. You know, you talked a little bit sort of about you know the empowerment, right? You know, that the boys in the ghetto, the boys in the ends, you know, actually got from doing that. Can you sort of elaborate a little bit on that? Because, you know, what makes this different from sort of the way, you know, rock music emerged in the 1970s or punk music emerged in the 1970s? I mean, the story of, you know, the people from the ghetto having the energy because they've got nothing but the energy to go against the system. I mean, that's sort of the cycle of cultural evolution in one way, but what makes sort of the Japan impact on grime, in your personal opinion, what makes the Japan impact on grime sort of special?
I think one key part of it that I discussed further in my article, and it would, I would like to raise now, is that the broader cultural context that they were living in and growing up with, and a longer historical or intellectual current of Afro-Asian exchange or Afro-Japanese encounters. One kind of more directly relevant encounter or cultural exchange that would have probably impacted their lives as well was, if you look at hip-hop music in America, you've got, and in the 70s, kung fu movies from Hong Kong cinema really influenced a lot of hip-hop artists in the 90s. Take Wu-Tang Clan, for example. They've created their whole personas around that. They created their whole personas around that. And I think that those stories of kind of the underdog, right? Bruce Lee, the underdog hero fighting against unjust societies, that really resonated and was drawn into hip-hop. And I think we can see some of those influences, that, like I said, that broader Afro-Asian cultural exchange or interactions coming out with the grime artists. But in this case, this was a different time, right? They were growing up, like I said, with the stuff that was around them, which was these Japanese pop cultural artifacts. And I think another element to that, which I started to touch on at the end as well, is that idea of Japan as the future. I mean, they could see in their lives that it didn't seem like there was a future there in Britain for them. And so they were looking for other futures in some way. And at the time, whether it was through a lot of these cyberpunk movies like Blade Runner, for example, in the late 80s, it was those images of the future that again resonated with their lives. Maybe we can exist in those spaces. I think that's where that kind of empowerment element came in, to answer your question.
No, I mean, it's very interesting, right? Because, I mean, you know, you sort of think of Japan as sort of cute, kawaii, you know, but hardly ever in terms of the power that the escapism offered, right? Have you spent a little bit of time with some of the game designers here in Japan? Because, you know, obviously Japan is a wonderful society, but it's also very strict and puts a lot of conformist pressure on people.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of the energy to create those games, to create that original virtual escapism, right? You know, in my personal opinion, probably comes also from the resistance and the resilience and the, oh my God, you know, what did you say? There was a wonderful quote, right? I want the future, I need the future to need me.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a very powerful thing, particularly when you're in your 60s. No, but in you know, in all seriousness, so, you know, sort of, have you given some thought about that? Because the original sort of, you know, what happened here in Japan? What are the escape valves, you know, here in Japan?
Yeah. I'm going to be converting this into a book over the next few years. So I do hope to be able to interview some of the game designers or the artists here in Japan as well. But I think one of the interesting elements in thinking about the game designers and composers, music composers in Japan, is that how they were already being influenced by the music cultures, let's say, in the UK. So we can talk about grime in a way before grime ever appeared. So let me just break that down a bit. Yuzo Koshiro, he was a game composer for Streets of Rage, Sonic, a couple of the examples that I used in my presentation. He was influenced by UK rave music in the late 80s, early 90s, and then used those sounds, right, as part of his Streets of Rage music. And then that's kind of found its way back again into grime. So I think what, again, is interesting about kind of cold Japan is that it's, I guess, from uncovering this hidden phenomenon, we can see broader historical currents of exchange that we may have not seen before. Another example, it's not necessarily a game composer, but and this was an article which became quite popular earlier in this year. It was in Nippon.com, I think. And it was talking about the slengten rhythm from Jamaican dancehall music in the 80s, and how that has become a template for a lot of the sounds in the evolution of reggae and dancehall in Jamaica. And that originated in a rock preset produced by, I think her name was Okuda Hiroko, who was working for Casio, and she produced the Casio tone kind of keyboard, and then there's a rock preset on that, and then that was taken and used in Jamaican dancehall. So again, we can see this constant culture exchange going back and forth, and these already hybridized culture that shapes the broader context that these grime artists were growing up with and has influenced the way they've developed their interaction and their unique expression of cold Japan.
Yeah. No, I mean, this feedback is always, you know, fascinating. And as they say, what is it? Good artists steal. No, good artists copy, great artists steal. Right? Something along those lines. Now, I want to switch gears for 30 seconds, if you don't mind, and you know, I do want to open it up to the audience a little bit. But you know, tell us a little bit about your own journey, right? Not to veer off subject. We'll get back to that with the Q&A. But just like, you know, a little bit of your own journey. You know, you're obviously from London.
Yeah.
And just tell us a little bit about how you got involved with Japan, what got you to come here, and what got you to, you know, to play video games.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot of overlap with my own personal experience that helped me kind of navigate this space and identify it. But there's also some quite big differences as well. I think in terms of my own connections to Japan, or starting back again, I think in a similar way that I was just mentioning about that broader Afro-Asian cultural exchange. My first interest in Asia was these kung fu movies again. I wanted to be Bruce Lee when I was younger. I knew that he lived on 16 Nathan Road in Kowloon. I remembered all of the facts about Bruce Lee. And then I was into Korean rap music when I was 14. So this was in the early 2000s, before the Korean wave and all of that. And then it turned to Japanese visual kei music. And kind of reflecting on why I was into kind of visual kei music, which is very, it's usually male performers, rock artists, dressing in a very effeminate way. I think part of that was this idea of expressing a different side of my own masculinity that maybe wasn't often expected of me, like I said, as a young black male in Britain. It was probably expected that I should be a sports star or an entertainer or something like that, or kind of hard and thuggish and things like that. But I was able to, I guess, in my own way, express a different side of my personality. And so, again, I mean, I think there's something that resonates here with what's going on with this whole grime phenomenon. I don't know how much you want me to go into my own personal
just
interaction with Japan, but yeah, I think that was yeah. But just on, I guess fortunately for me, I was able to actually come to Japan. I studied here for my first degree at ICU, Kokusai Kiristokyō Daigaku, and that's really taken me forward to pursue a career in Japanese studies. Now doing a PhD at Oxford, so. I'm glad that I can also draw on my own experiences to inform some of my research, but my core research is 19th century Japanese history. So
we talk about that, a little bit later. But again, I mean, this constant feedback loop that you get, and particularly, I think, here in Japan, the impact that Japan's culture, that Japan's soft power, actually has, on different parts and different genres. And now you obviously specializing in the music side here, is very, very often neglected. And it's very interesting to hear, that cold is actually not a negative in the sense of that, if I understand your talk correctly, that it does actually lead to this empowerment and sort of the creation of new spaces, new identities, and ultimately an escape from the ends. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think this idea of this coldness and this soft empowerment, right? I think, again, revealing this cold Japan and this hybrid space between Black Britain and Japan can also illuminate other similar cultural phenomenon and how Japan is providing these tools or this cultural capacity building, you could say in a way, for these countercultural expressions or movements. Yeah. So one example of that, one of my colleagues who's at Hong Kong Baptist University, Matea Kovacic, she's doing research on how, I guess you could say the similar idea of the cold spaces within Japanese pop culture is being used by protesters in Hong Kong. So a lot of the images of dystopian futures in Ghost in the Shell, or again, Naruto, and all of these similar types of cold spaces are being used in protest art to express the type of resistance or those ideas of collaboration with their fellow protesters and things like that. So again, by revealing these case studies or individual phenomenon, it shows broader countercultural movements that Japan has provided the platforms for in other comparative cases across the world as well. And I think that's why it's so important to kind of reveal these hidden transnational encounters, rather than just often when we think about cool Japan, it's often from the state-centered narratives of soft power influence and foreign policy on the governmental level. When we look at the grassroots or bottom-up or transnational level, then we start to see these interesting different kind of hybrid countercultures merging and expressing themselves.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it's exactly, it's not the glossy poster of the geisha, right?
Yeah.
But it's the evolution of a cyborg, right? Empowering an Afro-American, an Afro-American or an Afro-British person in the ghetto, right?
Yeah,
That's a part of soft power that I don't think the guy Musho spends too much time thinking about. Let me open the floor for any questions, any comments. Please.
Johnny, I do a small art foundation in Tokyo for 40 years. And we created the first Tate Gallery project outside of England with an artist in residency for the Tate in Tokyo. And so I was very much involved with the Brat Pack art group in London, from Tracy M. and Damien Hirst, the White Cube Gallery Mafia. And some of my heroes in that group, because I grew up as a close friend with James Baldwin. And so he's one of my, iconic mentors and masters and heroes. Other people for me in the British group are Steve McQueen, the artist, filmmaker, David Ajay, the architect. Do you have any reflections on these people like yourself? You don't look back. Everything is in front of you as a springboard, and you move on and make it better. You can sit around and lament all day long, or you can move on and make it better like you have done.
Sorry, can I just clarify your question? So in terms of the feeling of, like I was talking about earlier, with those feelings of marginalization and cold alienation, not just ending there, but them also taking that to go beyond that to recreate themselves?
That's correct.
Yeah. And I think you've really nailed it on the head there with what I was trying to express through this talk, but this phenomenon of grime, right? That's exactly what they're doing there. And I think, and again, like we were discussing, it's at the same time they did need those affordable technologies which were coming in from Japan at the time to be able to then, or those sounds, to be able to interpret their feelings, and then again, not just interpret it and see, okay, this feeling of cold alienation in the ends, but those stories offered hope as well. So I think it's those tools were really critical in powering them in some way, and I think it really perfectly expresses itself through this image or this animation that we've got on the screen now that I worked with Jason Adenuga, who is a designer, to create, to express this. And it's a nod to the Boy in the Corner album covers you may have seen earlier. But you can see how those artifacts are literally powering up the Grime Boys. So that, I think that's how I'd respond to that. Thank you.
Warren, you're also a DJ. Right? I mean, as one is, but the influence on grime, the influence on marginalized English musicians or creatives is very clear. Talk to me a little bit about, has something similar happened to the Japanese music scene? I mean, have they incorporated, the sort of dystopian elements, the cold sounds of the video games, or is this uniquely sort of a British phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of this has, in a way, originated in Japan, but also that constant cultural interaction or exchange and hybridized music forms that were influencing game music from the 80s and onwards. So I think that's the first kind of important broader context to establish. But just in terms of, I guess, how it's coming back to Japan. Firstly, there's a grime scene here in Japan. There are artists here in Japan. I was fortunate to be able to go to an underground performance recently and see them.
This was where? In Ikebukuro?
Oh, no, it's Shibuya.
Shibuya?
Yeah. I think in terms of these cold sounds appearing in Japanese music, we're seeing the hyperpop music phenomenon where they are drawing from, again, all of these hybridized sounds from, say, American trap, rap, hip-hop music that they're putting into hyperpop here in Japan, and then they're taking in rock and all these other elements to express life in the 21st century, which is essentially hectic and constantly online and social media and TikTok and all this speed of life.
What's TikTok?
But yeah, so that's how it's expressed itself in this genre called hyperpop music, for example. So I definitely think we can see that, which is very. I think Japan is kind of at the forefront of that kind of scene. Another example, which I think is really interesting, is how this idea of, often we think about, let's say, hip-hop music from America or rap music from America. When it's introduced in Japan, it's often on that element of kind of like a party lifestyle is where you see a lot of the popular artists. But we also need to think of the countercultural element of rap and hip-hop, and how is that expressing itself in Japan, let's say. And I think one of the things that I'm interested in to see is, and this is an ongoing kind of a topic of research, and I don't have any clear answers, but how Japanese artists are now collaborating with artists from Korea or China, so across East Asia, through rap music and performing videos in cities in Seoul or Shibuya, Shanghai. But is that possible that they can create a new East Asian youth identity through these countercultural forms? I think those are some really important questions that start to come out of this when we start to look at these types of exchanges.
Do you think that the government or that the sort of official policy should foster some of these underground exchanges? And is that even possible? I mean, these guys are not going to write grant applications.
I mean, I think the key part here is that I think a lot of these forms have developed from the ground up, right? It's bottom up, it's counterculture. So when potentially authorities get involved, it could take away from some of those countercultural elements which provide those transgressive spaces which allow for those certain types of exchanges. Let's just use the example of what I mentioned of this youth exchange, grassroots youth exchange across Japan, Korea, China, which through hip-hop music. What would it look like if a government was to get involved in that? I don't know, but potentially, and I think, could there be platforms that are created to facilitate this rather than trying to. And another thing which Grime shows us is that you can't really control the narrative. People take the stuff, remix it, break it apart, and use it in their own way. So you can't really dictate the narrative of soft power anyway, right? So maybe it's about facilitating platforms, providing spaces, providing the tools, and then letting them build upon it.
No, I mean, exactly. I mean, a lot of the power, a lot of the energy, right, a lot of the drive and the spark of life comes from the thrust against, the establishment, the anti-establishment, right? But at the same time, sort of the evolution that comes from that. And, perhaps, as you mentioned, creating platforms, right, where that freer exchange can actually happen. You can't dictate the future, but you can give the future a chance by creating the platforms, right? Maybe that's something where, where greater things can be done. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Sawako, we've got something from overseas.
Actually, it's here in Japan, but we have we have a question from Kondo Seiichi-san, the former commissioner of the Japanese Agency for Cultural Affairs. Kondo-san, arigatou gozaimasu. So his question is, it basically follows, what we're discussing now. But do you think Cold Japan catches the current international social cultural trend and will spread into the wider audience, such as those in North America and the continental Europe? What is the reaction of the ordinary Japanese to your argument? And how can we effectively make Cold Japan a source of soft power?
Wow.
Do you want a
Great
whiskey?
questions.
Do you want a whiskey?
Kondo-san, thank you very much for the question. We've had discussions in the past, so it's, I'm glad that we can continue it and engage, albeit virtually, today. The first question, I think I kind of touched on a bit of it earlier in terms of how this similar idea of coldness was expressing itself in protests in Hong Kong. I think another aspect in its broader geographical spread is I think there's a very similar thing going on within hip-hop music in America. You see the similar uses of Naruto and Dragon Ball Z for those same ideas of identity exploration and empowerment. There's also some key differences which I talk about in my article as well, so I'd encourage anyone to read it to kind of see that comparison with hip-hop. So I think that was the first answer to the first question. Yes, there's definitely this broader global spread of cold Japan. Can we convert it? I think I'm missing out the second question. I think the last one was, can we convert it into soft power?
Yep. The second question is, what is the reaction of the ordinary Japanese to your argument?
That's a very good and interesting question. I think, fortunately, I'm I'll do a little plug here. I've just finished translating it into the whole article, the 30 pages, into Japanese, and that will be coming out in the coming weeks. So I hope to get that exposed to more of a Japanese audience. In terms of those who I have interacted with so far, I think one of the big themes that comes out is in terms of the view of Britain, that they hadn't seen this side of Britain, the ends of Britain before. And I think that really speaks to some of the stereotypical images that we have of Britain, that of the kind of the afternoon teas and the Buckingham Palace, like Dizzy Rascal said earlier. It's not just that, right? There's a broader history of global Britain, right? And I think that's one of the things which a lot of people are quite surprised, that there's this other dimension of Anglo-Japanese exchange. So I think that's how I'd respond to the question of how a Japanese audience would see this article. In terms of how to convert it into soft power, I think it's what I was saying before, this idea of platforms versus promotion. On a theoretical level, I think what this Cold Japan brings out is, like I said, Japan is in a way providing these tools, spaces, sounds, structures of feelings these cultural platforms that people are disassembling and reassembling and building upon. Whereas a lot of the approaches to soft power is, and especially, I guess I would say, kind of more recent shifts, it's on promotion, right? It's, we want this narrative of Japanese pop culture. This is the way it should be interpreted. So whether that's the Japanese government wants to interpret it in a certain way, policy papers talk about like a tadashi sugata, a correct understanding. Or the manufacturers of these games, right? They want people to play with it in a certain way. Whereas these artists were like destroying this stuff, right? They were taking apart, using it in a completely different way. I mean, this is a silly example, but they were, I don't know, like getting like you know, the masu cups for sake, using that as for like a jewelry box, right? They're using it in completely different ways. So it's not the correct way of using it. However, there's obviously, and I should point out, there's obviously potential dangers with cultural misappropriation there, but that's an important caveat to note. But I think the key takeaway here on a, not on the theoretical side, but on the policy implications is how can we then create platforms? What would that look like to create a platform? So let's say with the Japanese government, MOFA's initiative of the Japan House, how can that be used as a platform for other people to display how they've used Japan, rather than this kind of like unidirectional dissemination of this is how we want you to understand the culture. There's dangers there, right? It's letting other people take control. But I think in this world of this remix world, I think that's really going to be the new approach to soft power.
This discussion is hugely relevant in the whole startup nation, venture capital, business, because the tadashi sugata, right, which the Japanese, officialdom is very, very insistent on, right? But, what actually happens, and the more interesting stuff that happens, is actually at the margins. I had a long discussion with the people from the largest car company that are trying to build this smart city. And of course, the goal of the smart city is to be nice and comfortable, but also to be very, very innovative. And I said, well, where does innovation come from? A lot of it comes from the ghetto, from the low-rent district, from the ghetto. That's where the real breakthroughs come from. Maybe not in quantum computing, but how quantum computing eventually is going to be commercialized, is going to be applied, that's not going to happen, on Fifth Avenue, as it were. That's going to happen, in Ikebukuro, right? So it's a very, very relevant, debate, and I think particularly as the world is eager and trying to, turbocharge our escapism. I mean, we're going from video games into, what's that thing called? The metaverse. Right? And so we're going to be all, living in this virtual space, and there'll be lots of ends, coming up in this. Now, I want to sort of, if in the final comments, I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator and steer you a little bit. You're doing this PhD. Right? And you're doing this PhD, which again, I found out, from you. It's absolutely fascinating. You said you're a historian. Tell us a little bit about your PhD, what you're researching there.
Yeah, so
and he doesn't want to give away any secrets. So
yeah, I mean, in a way, in one way, it's a world away from this cold Japan research. It's in the 19th century. Again, a time of turmoil, of course, in Japan, looking at the Meiji Ishin, restoration, revolution, transition, transformation, however we want to interpret it. And I'm looking at those who are producing satire, so critiquing the government's idea of Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, Fukoku Kyohei, strong army, rich country. And I think, in a way, the common thread here between what I'm looking at, it's those on the edges of society, right? It's it's not through music, but it's through art or literature or wordplay. But yeah, so I think that's an important common thread throughout my work, looking at the people on the edges of society, looking how they, often we don't think of them interacting transnationally, crossing borders, looking how they may interact across borders. And what does that how does that transnational approach, looking at those on the edges of society, reframe the way we understand these bigger histories and historical currents? And I think that's the broader methodological approach that I take to my research that informs 19th century Japan or present day with grime or the future, right? And I think that's how we can get to, to use a bit of a trite and hackneyed word, to get to some innovation to like I said, reframe the way we understand existing discourses or narratives.
It was very interesting when we first, sort of discussed this. I think over a breakfast, and I asked him, "Well, what's your PhD on?" And he said, "Oh, it's about laughter and satire in post-Meiji," which sort of is a bit more of a relaxed answer. But again, Japan, when you look at the history, there are very powerful, very strong currents of the people who go against the grain. Right, who don't want to follow the Tarashi Sugata. Let me ask a final question. As somebody who's been living in Japan now for quite a while, right? Somebody who's absolutely fluent in Japanese. You're also teaching at one of the Japanese universities, so you're exposed, to the youth culture here. Often, you hear this complaint that the youth that the current youth has lost its edge. What are your views on that? Are they still, prepared to fight the fight and, to go against the establishment, or have they all been pacified?
Ooh.
Sorry.
I think one of the biggest challenges I find in interacting with my students, let's say at university, is when it gets to around the third year, suddenly there's no students in class anymore, and they're off.
Don't take it personally.
No, I don't take it personally at all. I don't take it personally. They're wearing the job hunting suits, the shukatsu suits. If they do come to class, and they're looking very tired and weary from a long day listening to Setsumeikai, the explanation, the introduction sessions to companies. So anyway, what I'm trying to say by this long introduction is that there's a kind of a transition in their lives which is kind of making them shift into conforming with society or corporate culture and things like that. And that may potentially take away some of the edge that they were showing in some of their earlier classwork or club activities and all of these types of things. I think that's a really kind of interesting key period in youth development in Japan that I think, requires a lot of further discussion, and I think this is why this type of group, I'm sure, is having those really important discussions all the time. So I look forward to engaging further.
Great. Warren, fantastic. We could go on for a long time, but this is a journey. I'm very, very glad that so many people joined us today. I'm not sure that there's any conclusion, but it's just hopefully a greater awareness, that the feedback loop that exists between Japan's soft power, and how it reverberates around the various parts of the world. I mean, wow, I wasn't aware of the impact on the Hong Kong demonstrators. I was, of course, very aware of the impact on grime music because no, but but this reverberation, this is where creativity, this is where innovation, comes from, and I think we all do very, very well to remind ourselves you know, that the design, the artistic, the creative spark in anything that we are trying to do as business people or as policy leaders, you know, we should not forget about that, and we should probably work a little harder to create those spaces, those platforms, you know, where new energies can even be created, you know, even if they are a little bit transgressive, even if they are going a little bit against the establishment, because if you're not told what's bad about you, you don't have a friend. Thank you very much. I want to thank you know, Warren again very, very much.